And can you see me okay? I'm hoping your answer is yes. All right, so welcome to Mondays with Mel, and we are going to get started today. Mondays with Mel happens each week at 2 p.m. here via social media. Each week I cover a different mental health topic in which we give advice and tips. We cover a different thing that brings awareness about mental health, as well as just gives overall tips on different things that we all can be doing to make sure that we are doing our best to take care of ourselves, not just physically, but mentally as well. There will be times that you will also see that I have a special guest, and I will also have a special guest today. So I am so super excited about today's topic. Today we are talking about grappling with grief during a new normal. So take a minute, go ahead and share, because this is going to be a really good session today. Okay, go ahead and share, take a minute. We're talking about grief. We're going to talk about all things dealing with the cycle of grief. We're going to look at what it means for us in our culture to celebrate life, the celebration of life, better known as funerals, and what that also means in Black culture. We are also going to talk about different stressors that pastors and leaders have during this time of grief and loss, and what that means even in the church setting. Okay, so go ahead, take a minute and just share for me really quickly as we go ahead and we get ready to get started. In the church setting. All right. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started here. So listen, I'm on two different screens here. I'm on two different screens, so I'm actually listening to myself echo. Hey ladies. Hello. Hey there. So listen, guys, go ahead and share as we get ready to talk about grief, okay? And I have a very special guest who will be joining me shortly. She is phenomenal. And she was the perfect person to join me for today's topic. Hello, Lance. How's it going? All right, she was the perfect person. And hey there.
Hello.
She was the perfect person, guys. And so with no further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce my very special guest who is here with me today. Guys, she is such a jewel. And there was no better person that I could think of to join me on this topic. She is a wife, she's a mother, she's a doctoral student completing her doctorate in African American preaching and sacred rhetoric from CTS, Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis, Indiana. Listen, when I say she wears a multitude of hats, she is who I consider a phenomenal woman, phenomenally. She is also the interim senior pastor at Light of the World Christian Church in Indianapolis, Indiana. So please help me welcome the Reverend R. Janae Pitts-Murdock.
Thank you so much for having me today.
It is so great to have you, and I say it to you all the time. With all of the hats you wear, I don't even know how you do it. So thank you for taking the time to join us for this conversation, this rich conversation. And I know we've shared in conversation regarding grief and just, on other topics because we go back quite a ways. But I want you, if you don't mind, to just briefly share with our audience your story when it comes to grief and loss.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me say I really appreciate you for inviting me for this conversation. I think that conversations about grief and loss are too few in our communities, particularly in communities of faith and in communities of color. And so where those communities intersect, communities of faith of color, those conversations happen even fewer than I think they should. So I appreciate you for inviting me for this conversation today. My journey with grief is both a personal one and a professional one. Mm-hmm. Professionally, as a member of clergy, I journey with individuals in the grief process, whether it is the loss of loved one, whether it is the loss of relationship. Oftentimes individuals come to clergy persons for counseling, and they also come to us when they're ready to bury their loved one who has transitioned from this life into the next. So professionally, I have that experience with grief and loss from I don't want to call it a distant, but there is some distance between it being my personal experience and the personal experience of someone else. But then on the other side, I have my own personal experience with grief and loss. In August of 2018, my mother passed away. And I am the only child born to my mom. My mother had tons of kids. She was the kind of well-regarded, well-respected leader in our community in Detroit, highly esteemed in our church and in denominational work there. At the same time, I was an only child, and my mother and I were super, super close. She was probably more of a best friend than she probably should have been as a parent. But she was great. She was strict and stern and grace-filled at the same time. And I credit her for virtually all of who I am. And so when she passed away completely unexpectedly, she was in the midst of travel and collapsed in the airport parking lot. Wow. The medics were unable to resuscitate her. And so, losing her so suddenly and unexpectedly was challenging. Mm-hmm. And here we are 2 years later, and my grief has transitioned into gratitude. I have journeyed through all of those official stages of grief, if you will. Mm-hmm. And I have arrived at a place where I'm just grateful that God gave me the woman that God gave as my mom, and that I was able to have her for the number of years that I had her. I'm grateful that my children were able to have a relationship with her. I'm grateful that my husband still, shares stories with me so fondly. I'm grateful that because of my mom, my husband and our family has enlarged by an additional child. The young lady that my mom was raising chose to come and live with us when my mom transitioned. And so I'm just grateful that through her, my life has been so richly blessed. So that's a quick spiel about, I guess, my grief journey and my grief experience.
Mm-hmm. And so I can't hear you. I think
So did I answer your question the way
you did.
okay.
You absolutely did. And I know I've shared this with you before, just in having watched you from afar in going through loss, and the way you have embraced being able to share in a way different parts of your journey, has been both inspiring, but also just kind of a testament to the courage and resiliency that I've watched and witnessed. And for me, there wasn't a better person to join in this topic, because having that experience and walking through it, as well as being a clergy person, and being in the seat of the pastor at this point. You kind of, again, cover all angles, right, so to say. And so I in listening to you talk about that story, and just thinking of just personal loss.
Mm-hmm.
I think, as I, in last week's episode, but in last week's segment, I was sharing about losing a child. My husband and I, we lost our firstborn child. And, there was not just the grieving of losing a child, but, afterwards, I had blood clots, and it was such a terrible situation that literally we were told, don't try that again. Do not try that again. Just, you call it quits. Consider yourself lucky, consider yourself blessed that you are still alive. And so I found that I was not just grieving the loss of a child, but I was also grieving the loss of an opportunity, per se, because it seemed as if the opportunity had been taken away, if that makes sense. And so, that being said, I kind of want to jump into the first part of this segment, regarding the different types of grief and the different types of loss. And, kind of what are your thoughts on the different types and the different phases of loss and grief?
Incidentally, I preached a sermon yesterday at Light of the World Christian Church here in Indianapolis. I did not anticipate that the sermon would be centered on grief as much as it was. We are in a series on the Psalms that were written during the time of exile. So the Israelites have been forcibly taken from Israel and taken to Babylon. And their temple has been destroyed. And so the Psalms that we're using, we're using kind of as a window into what people of faith experienced with their loss. And it turned out that I ended up interpreting Psalm 89 as a window into the Israelites' grief. And perhaps where they were in their stages of grief, and that there are personal experiences of grief.
Absolutely.
Just like there are communal experiences of grief. And we don't necessarily talk about communal grief as a process. But, I have my individual loss. And then as a community can lose something as well.
Right.
And in the case of the Israelites, they lost familiarity with their homes. They lost familiarity with their temple. They lost familiarity with their land of residence. So I think that understanding that there are different kinds of grief and different kinds of loss help us to journey with one another better. particularly now as we are in this COVID-19 environment, there is communal loss that is happening. We have all lost our sense of freedom. Some aspect of our freedoms have been taken away. And I'm not referring to those patriotic freedoms, but I am referring to these individual liberties that we have, that we've probably have taken for granted. The ability to go to the hair salon, the ability to go to gather in groups of more than 10. So these kinds of adjustments that have taken place could be interpreted as loss. So I think there is an individual loss, but also a group or communal loss.
Right, absolutely.
Realizing that there's some aspect of this that we are journeying together, which helps us realize I'm not alone, because the grief process can also be isolating and alienating. But knowing that there is a communal aspect, at least in the COVID-19 circumstance, means that you don't have to go through the process of grief alone. Right.
I think that, it's also important to note, that there is a difference between grief and loss, right? Yeah. As we were talking about earlier. And, the grief that's the emotion, that's the reaction that we use as we're processing the loss.
That's right.
Right. And so as you talked about the loss of just these freedoms, just the simple freedom to go to and fro as we would like to, those are different losses that we have that we can grieve. I was sharing with someone, just even when we talk about grief from the perspective of just even looking at the top 3 types of grief. The top 3 types are anticipatory grief, which is where that something is going to happen. Like, someone is sick. That you've been told that a job is closing, and you have 3 months, you have a month to prepare for such a loss. Those are what's considered anticipatory. That's anticipatory grief. There's also normal grief, in which, it is just normal. It's just, you're sad. It is a normal reaction. But then we get to that complicated grief. And I think that is where we get into when people sometimes don't even know they're grieving, or grieving the loss is too hard because it was traumatic, or as I think you were saying earlier, what happens when you're the person who's the oldest in a family, or the only child in a family. And in the process of maybe burying a loved one, all of the responsibility is there. And so you have what's considered not just complicated grief, but you fall into what's considered delayed grief.
Delayed grief, yeah.
So what are your thoughts in reference to, I guess, just how do we deal with the complicated grief?
Woo! Well, I would argue, this isn't a non-scholarly fashion, because you indeed are the mental health professional, but I would argue that in communities of color, all grief is complicated.
Oh, that's good.
And I would say that because in minority communities, dispossessed communities, marginalized communities, where we are already in a place of disenfranchisement, you're already dealing with poverty or health crisis. There are already other factors at play, in addition to whatever this acute loss is. And so one of the best things that we can do as a community is to make space for grief. Grief is not a bad thing.
Right.
It's not a negative thing. It is not a sign of weakness to grieve. It is not a sign that you are unspiritual or unholy to
Absolutely.
grieve. Because there are also pockets of our communities that tend to stigmatize the process of grief, thereby making it even more complicated.
Right.
Meaning that I am unable to grieve openly. I am unable to grieve freely. That I have to compartmentalize myself so that I can help other people be okay with my grief. And so you're right. There are all sorts of complications that come with grief. And I think one of the best things that we can do, particularly now that we're in COVID-19, is to make room for grief. It is okay to acknowledge that life is not what I thought it would be. I am unhappy and dissatisfied. I am disappointed. My heart is broken. I am trying to reconcile that my expectations about what I thought graduation would be like are unmet. I have to reconcile that what I expected my April wedding to be, that those expectations are unmet. And these are all losses that lead us, hopefully, to a grief process that will be healthy. And the more we can make room for grief, allow people to grieve, and be educated about what grief looks like, the more we can help people grieve in a healthy and wholesome way. And you said something a little earlier about, stages of grief. And, those of us who do not embrace the grief process, we'll stay in denial, or we'll stay in those early stages that cause us to suppress or repress our emotions. And ultimately, once we begin to acknowledge them, then we hit that anger. Right. And this anger blows up because we've been suppressing or repressing. We've been in that state of denial for an extended period of time. And so the community around you is like, what's wrong with you? Why are you mad all the time?
Absolutely.
Because we're not competent enough about grief. And we say, oh, that's what this is. But then we have a lack of empathy. So we try to rush you through grief. We try to hurry you along so that you can hurry up and be okay, because your grief makes me uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
And so, there are all kinds of ways that our grief becomes complicated. And you've named some. Listen, we all need a therapist too. Can you put your phone number or your contact information up here? Folks know you're an amazing therapist, counselor.
Yes. I do all of that at the end.
Okay. All right. Okay.
But yeah, you are absolutely right in the fact that, especially in our community, we don't always get the chance. We don't have time, shall we say.
That's a good one.
We don't have time.
That's a good one.
Grieve. We have to keep it moving. We can handle it. I will busy myself to not deal with the grief, right? To not deal with the process.
And I will allow other people to busy me.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Right? Because I think that we also have agency in the way we allow other people to overwhelm us, overwork us, overburden us. And we take on other people's lack of responsibility for their own grief and their own process.
Right.
And we take those on too. I interrupted you. I'm sorry. I should not have done that.
No, go ahead.
No, that's it. I mean, we don't have time to grieve. You hit it right there.
Right.
I wonder how many people who are watching today have not grieved because they have convinced themselves they don't have time to grieve.
Right. Right.
And how many people have delayed their grief or put off their grief because I can't deal with it right now. You know, I have a newborn child, so I can't deal with it right now. Or I just got a new job, so I can't deal with it right now. Or I just relocated, so I can't deal with it right now. Or I have a younger sibling who is going through their own issues, so I can't deal with my stuff because I have to help this sibling or this loved one with their stuff.
Right.
All kinds of ways we don't have time. You said it.
Right. And, you know, and we tend to look at that as if it makes us stronger. Right. Because I think that's another thing. I think I lost your volume.
Oh, I haven't said anything.
Oh, so I think another thing is, you know, we tend to look at this as if it makes us stronger. Right. We don't have time. And I'm such a strong individual that it's okay. I don't need to process this. I can put it away and compartmentalize it in this tiny box and keep moving along with life as usual. You know, and I think even as we talk about the losses that we are experiencing with COVID-19, you know, as you stated, there are weddings, there are graduations, there are vacations, there are family reunions, there are, you know, the thought of, you know, I'm from Mississippi. My husband, we're from Mississippi, so we're from the South, and the thought of not even being able to travel to see loved ones. Right? There's a loss of just the freedom to travel back and forth the way we normally would. And so when we're looking at these losses and we're trying to grapple with the reaction that we have, I think that's where it gets convoluted. You know, when we're looking at the process, right? The loss is there. But when we're looking at the process, the grieving, the reaction, the emotion that we attach to it, that is where I believe we are at a standstill. And so I kind of want to look at the cycle of grief. You know, I know we kind of mentioned it a minute ago. And there were originally 5, but you know, of course, if you Google, there are a ton now that you will see. But originally there were 5 that were developed by Elizabeth Ross, and then she revamped it later into 7 that were specifically for people who were experiencing loss. And so the stages are shock, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, testing, and acceptance. So I'm going to say that again. So these 7 stages: the shock, that is the initial, just you are numb because of this news you've heard, right? Then there is denial. That is trying to avoid it. The question is, how many of us are still in denial? How many of us are in denial when it comes to loss of whatever it may be, whether it is a death or a vacation or job or finances? Have we gotten stuck in denial? There is the anger stage. This is the frustrating outpour of bottled up emotion. There is bargaining. There is the depression stage. The depression stage is that realization that it is happening and it is inevitable. And some of us, we get to the depression stage and we stay there.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be a dangerous place. So it's important to know that if you get stuck in any of these stages, that's when it's time to also seek help from a professional. There's the testing stage, which gets you closer to moving into acceptance. And so testing is when we are looking for a new normal, which, of course, we're in COVID-19 right now. And we are, I think, still searching for what a new normal resembles, what it looks like, even as we move forward with the way we process loss. So those are the steps. But how do you, Pastor Janae, how do you think COVID-19 has interrupted our coping, our processing through the cycle?
That is a great question. Because, so one of the things that I love about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's kind of exploration of these stages,
Mm-hmm.
she says that it is not linear, that you can return to some other stage.
Yes, absolutely.
You may not necessarily go shock, denial, anger. You might go shock, denial, bargaining, anger, and then back to denial, and then up to testing, and then back to denial again. That there are, that there's not a linear way to get through the stages, and that you can return to a stage.
Right.
And when you specifically ask about how these stages are impacted by COVID-19, I think that external factors like the mass media influences how we return over and over again to this recurring grief cycle. We can't all the way get to acceptance because there are always these new pieces of information that shift how we move through the process. For example, when we listen to the news and we learned about how testing is happening, and we're watching a decline in new COVID cases. So there's a sense of hopefulness because there's a decline in cases, but then 2 days later we hear there's an increase. So now whatever progress we were making in the process is now reverted because of new information. And now we enter kind of this, we enter again into this grief process. And so, and now that the country is quote unquote reopening, there's a sense among some corners of our society that we're returning to normal, that everything is okay. Well, that's not necessarily the case, because what some of us perceive as normal is never to return again. And so so there's this sense of this repeated grief, because once the country, the city, the state reopens, we enter into this new experience and realize this is not what I thought it was.
Right.
Churches, for example, are now trying to figure out, how do we resume worship services? Listen, the church we knew 6 months ago is not here. I mean, you know, there are some states that are saying 10 people can gather, 20 people can gather, 50 people can gather. And for those of us who have congregations that are well beyond that number, it is just a new environment, which means that people are also grieving the loss of religious experience. They are grieving the loss of what this community used to be like.
Right.
And so I think COVID-19 has created all kinds of losses that have initiated all kinds of grief processes. And unfortunately, there are some people among us who are still in denial, who refuse to accept that life like we knew it is gone.
Absolutely.
And so I think that COVID-19 has created what I call perpetual grief. In some ways, this could be traumatic grief,
Mm-hmm.
because it's one of those things we can't control, we can't change. It keeps happening over and over and over again. There's this recurrent, perpetual experience, and so I grieve that I grieve that communities of faith are not as prepared for this experience of communal grief.
Wow.
We like to, as we like to think.
Right. And we're going to get more into that in just a moment. But I want to share this quote. There's a quote that says, "When words are inadequate, have a ritual." And for birthdays, we do parties, we do weddings to celebrate getting married, and we also believe in celebrating the life of someone who passes, right? What are your thoughts regarding, as we talk about loss, what are your thoughts on the loss of a loved one? I know we've talked about a lot of different loss, but when it comes to death, right? And especially with the amount of deaths that have happened throughout this process of COVID-19. What are your thoughts regarding the importance of that celebration of life, that funeral, that going to the funeral home, that last goodbye? What are your thoughts on that?
I have enjoyed. I'll answer it backward.
Okay.
I have enjoyed this preaching series that we're in now. The name of the series is Pandemic Playlist: Psalms for a People in Exile.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons why I have enjoyed this playlist and enjoyed this series is because the exiled Israelites give us a window into how communities have experienced this before. So a lot of us like to say, oh, this has never happened. Nothing like this has ever happened. Nothing like this has ever happened. Well, it probably hasn't happened in our lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
But there are models that exist for communities in history that have experienced these kinds of communal crises, communal losses. The transatlantic slave trade, is an example of how communal grief happens, the loss of intimate relationships, families are torn apart, forced apart, and all kinds of atrocities occurred in that time period. And we can use the experience of our ancestors in those moments and how they adapted to their new environment. Mm-hmm. Because if they don't adapt, they will die. They will mentally die if they don't adapt to the reality of their new environment. And so our African ancestors, just like our Israelite ancestors, developed new rituals. Mm-hmm. The church as we know it must adapt and develop new rituals. If we refuse to adapt to the new environment, we will find that our faith practice becomes a stoic religion. Right. And at least Christianity is not a dispassionate, it is a dynamic faith tradition. So certainly we have the ability to adapt and develop new rituals. And so as it relates to people who have died, mm-hmm. we have to be creative and develop new rituals. Mm-hmm. So we are learning how to hold worship or ceremonies over Zoom. We're learning how to share materials and resources through the mail. We are learning how to, at least I've already done one eulogy over Zoom. I've emailed eulogies. We've done them over speakerphone and over recordings. And so there's some aspects of our rituals that we'll have to adapt.
Right.
And but the most heart-wrenching thing is for people who are experiencing loss during COVID-19. I've heard stories of families who've not been able to claim the bodies of their loved ones.
Right.
I've heard stories of families not being able to access not the cremation of their loved ones has been delayed for weeks at a time. Just terrible, terrible stories of trauma on top of grief.
Right.
Or trauma on top of the loss that they're attempting to grieve. So those of us who are in the communities of faith, we are just trying to be as responsive as we can within reason.
Right.
To be family, to be community, but ultimately the church in particular and every other faith tradition is going to have to adapt in some way, shape, or form in order to maintain its relevance in a time like this.
Right. Absolutely. I know one of, even as we talk about that celebration of life and those rituals, if we shift that to Black culture, just us, we have a tendency to, we do it big, mainly, if we're honest. We celebrate in a different way than some other cultures when it comes to celebrating the life of a loved one. And I think it's important to understand that for many people, the grieving process or moving through that process, for many people, does not even really start until that ritual has happened.
Mm-hmm.
And in understanding how big of a piece that is for people who, as you've said, who are still waiting to claim bodies, who have not been able to have those rituals and those ceremonies the way that they normally would, especially within the African American culture, because for many of us, that is where we find support to move forward. That is where we search kind of for that meaning of what's next. The looking forward into what does a new normal look like. So there is, I think, a lot of unrest and a lot of just there is no reconcile at this point. And so, as you were saying, looking at new rituals, because I think it's important to understand that just because the ritual of old isn't available, we can't get stuck because we can't do it the way we're used to doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we get stuck, then we're not really able to move forward in the grieving process, in that cycle of grief. And therein lies the danger of complicating it even more, so to say.
You know what? And when you were explaining that, that's the exact thing that came to my mind. You have just named complication on top of complication, because you're right. In many faith traditions, the ritual marks, the ritual is a milestone, right? And so when we are unable to experience the ritual as we expect, then whatever succeeding process also doesn't happen as we suspect, which is a loss. Right. So absolutely. I am experiencing loss because I can't do, so one, I have the ritual, I have the loss of a loved one.
Right.
But then I have another loss that I cannot access my loved one the way that I'd expected. Then I have another loss because everybody who wants to come to the funeral cannot come to the funeral. Then I have another loss because I don't know, now the coroner tells me I can't access my loved one's remains for another 6 weeks. So that's 5 losses, and I still haven't made it to the quote unquote ritual. And so we then must grieve all of those losses.
Right.
You can't have loss and not grieve it. You can choose to not grieve it, but it is virtually impossible to move forward if you don't go through the process of grief for the loss.
Right.
So we, at least in this moment, we are grieving a lot of losses. And my heart breaks for folks who are going through just craziness in general. My husband and I, we have a 3rd grader and a kindergartner and a high school senior.
Mm-hmm. Sounds familiar.
Right? They are grieving. High school senior is grieving that graduation and prom and all of these other things that are supposed to happen as a high schooler don't happen the way you expect them to, right? But then our 3rd grader and our kindergartner, they're grieving the playground.
Yes.
They're grieving not seeing their friends. Mm-hmm. And it is so unfortunate that as a mom and as a dad, my husband and I, we are then trying to help our children navigate their grief.
Right.
We are also navigating our own grief.
Right.
So, you know, for those of us who are saying goodbye to loved ones right now, that's on top of other COVID-19 stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I encourage everyone to do is to get some help. Engage a therapist. Get someone you can talk to, that you can process with, someone with whom you can be honest, someone with whom you can freely share your frustrations, your concerns, your anxieties. And here at Light of the World, we launched what we're calling wellness groups, which are small groups led by mental health professionals. They're just conversation groups where members of our church can gather with folks in similar situations, whether that is, I am working from home with kids, I am caring for an aging parent, I am unmarried, I am over 60 and I don't know how to use Zoom, right? So not that 60 and Zoom are mutually exclusive, but we launched these groups to give people an opportunity to process and express what they're feeling. And so for those folks who are having to say goodbye to loved ones, I would really, really encourage them to engage a therapist, engage a professional who can help them process through that loss.
Right. I agree. You said quite a few things that were on my list of ways that people can utilize to cope in this season. So the first one I was thinking was acknowledging that there is pain. You know, instead of suppressing it, acknowledge it. And as you said, share it with, even if it's not to the point of needing a professional, share it with someone you trust, to share it with someone you trust with your feelings. Mm-hmm. Share it with someone who you trust with your heart, you know, but being able to express that there is pain, because even if we don't acknowledge it, it doesn't go away. You know, I often use in therapy, I'll put something on the floor and I'll cover it with a sheet of paper. and I'll just keep covering it with things, and I'll say, you know, no matter how many times we say, oh, I'm good, and we cover it with this, or we cover it with that, at the end of the day, it is still there. And you can never unfeel what you have already felt. So if you have felt pain, you can't unfeel it.
Yep.
No matter how you try, no matter what we say or how independent or strong we think we are. So making sure that we can acknowledge that pain, accepting and having grace to understand that my pain or my grief may show up in unforeseen ways. You know, it may trigger an emotion that is unexpected, that is different, and having the grace to understand that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, sometimes people don't understand why they just burst into tears. You know, you're happy, everything's fine, and all of a sudden, here come the tears.
Yeah.
Well, you know, those emotional outbursts can happen. And guess what? That is okay, because everyone has their own grief journey. Everyone has their own journey with loss.
Yep.
And giving yourself the grace to understand that no one's journey is the same as the next person.
That's right.
And then having people around you that, as you said in the beginning, aren't pressuring you to hurry up and get over it, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the other things that I wrote down was seeking that face-to-face support when you do need it, and understanding that there is a difference between grief and depression. Because when grief sets in and you cannot get out of the depressed stage,
Mm-hmm.
it's important to be able to reach out to a professional. Or even if you are not the person who is grieving the loss, but maybe you're the person who is the friend or who is the family member, and you see that happening, you know, making sure that you notice those things and that you reach out and you help them, because we can get stuck in that depressed state. So those are just, you know, a few of the ways that we can, you know, as we go through COVID-19 and as we're moving forward, we have to admit that it just sucks.
Yeah, it does.
You know, and it's okay to say that it hurts, it's painful, it's unfair, it's unfortunate. And like you said, even when it comes to our kids, I am often sad because, you know, they can't go play with their friends, you know, and they're walking around sad and depressed and they're fighting, and, you know, so there are all of these things, and it is okay to acknowledge that it is not cool, that it is hard.
Yep.
You know, it is what makes us human. If there is nothing else that COVID-19 is teaching us, it is giving us the opportunity to be a little more transparent.
Yeah.
And learning to be a little more empathetic with others, and showing not just ourselves, but showing our family members, showing our children that it's okay to acknowledge hurt. It's okay to acknowledge that we're sad. You know, I think a lot of us grew up thinking, hey, I'm doing a great thing when I can act strong and tough all of the time, right? And never acknowledge that something really hurt me.
Yep.
Or I'm not feeling quite myself. But being able to acknowledge that pain. Okay. Lastly, before we get ready to wrap up, there was a Facebook.
Wrapping up.
I know it's listen, it has been almost an hour. I know. There was a Facebook Live a week or so ago, maybe longer, that was hosted by Bishop Joseph Walker and several other prominent pastors and leaders, including Bishop T.D. Jakes, as well as Dr. Stephanie, Bishop Walker's wife. And Dr. Stephanie, during this live, she was shedding light on the fact that pastors too are grieving, you know, and they are grieving the loss of what you came into 2020 thinking was happening with your church, right? And right. And so she talked about that, and it was as if this panel of pastors just froze.
Wow.
Because she hit it. She hit it with the fact that there is loss. And even though as clergy and as leaders, you are helping everybody else, that there is still that warning sign for pastors to also be aware and have that moment of knowing, like, hey, there's still loss that you are experiencing as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Listen, that is so true. Now, just like everybody has their own experience of grief, all of us who are pastoring have our own experience of grief as pastors. So we're not all the same.
Right.
It depends on the congregation, So, but I am the interim pastor at Light of the World in Indianapolis. And my tenure as interim began in August of 2019 and will end in November of 2020. And so when I came in as interim, I came in with some very focused ideas, goals, plans, and strategies to help the congregation bridge between where they were in their own grief and where the congregation was in its own journey toward wellness. And the calling of their new permanent pastor. Well, COVID-19 hits, and my interim plan is like out the window. All of these things that I had hoped to accomplish, that we were making progress on. I mean, we're making great headway in a couple strategic areas of emphasis. And then COVID-19 hits, and all of a sudden, I have new strategic priorities. Overnight, our church shifts from meeting in person, being that kind of church where everything happens on site, where now nothing happens on site. And the only thing we do on site is our food pantry. Our missions work still happens here, but everything else is online. Our church is 153 years old. Most of our members are over the age of 50. And so while many of them are technologically astute, we all had to kind of strengthen our tech tools, right? Because overnight we become a virtual church. I'm like, this was not a part of my plan.
Not the plan.
My ministry was not a strategic initiative for my interim senior pastor plan. And so now I find myself, what am I? I'm 6 months. What month is this? This is May. So I am 5 months or so off from the end of my tenure. And so I have to acknowledge that what I had hoped to accomplish won't get accomplished. At least it won't get accomplished in the way that I had hoped it would. Right. And so there's loss. that is a loss. And I have to grieve that. But I got to grieve that while I'm still producing on the here and now, right? Right. So that whole thing you were talking earlier about, I don't have time to grieve. For me, I value the process of grief. And so a good girlfriend soror of mine, we say we grieve as we go. Yeah. So we grieve in the margins. We cry in the margins. We, these little creaks that creaks and cracks that life gives us. Those are the moments when we exhale and when we pause to make space for grief, because that's a real thing. Dr. Walker was on it.
Oh, absolutely. And so the last thing, of course, no one can expound like Bishop T.D. Jakes. And so they were giving closing remarks, and he was the one who went to the fact that he didn't want congregants, and he didn't want the world to think that pastors don't care. because, the church is not open, or because, they're not able to do the funerals as normal, and the rituals as normal. What are your thoughts on the stressors, the leader stressors, as it relates to walking families through this new way of grieving their loss, right? So, with the new ritual, as well as the unsaid, unspoken, the unspoken ridicule, right? What are your thoughts on that?
I can't say what I want to say, but what I will say.
What will you say?
We can't please everybody.
Absolutely.
And as pastors, we do the best we can.
Absolutely.
Now, there are some of us who need a little more help than others, but for the most part, pastors are doing the very best we can.
Absolutely.
With the resources we have in our hands.
Absolutely.
And we carry unmentionable burdens for our churches, for our families, for our communities, for ourselves. And so I can only speak for me. I make peace with unmet expectations.
I'll say that. Say that one more time.
I make peace with unmet expectations.
That's good.
I have learned to be okay when individuals are unhappy with my inability to do what they expect of me, what they want of me, or what they ask of me. But I really do the very best I can to meet as many needs as possible for as many people as possible, including myself.
Absolutely.
And so I am in no way able to be a good pastor to Light of the World, or for anyone else for that matter, if I slowly sacrifice myself along the way, because eventually I won't have anything left to give. So while I am helping others, I am working. I haven't always been it. The older I get, the better I get. I am trying to be much more intentional about being kind to myself, about letting go of the guilt that comes with unmet expectations. I am trying to be better about investing in my own soul and my own energies. I have one of my former bosses used to say, walk slowly and breathe deeply. I didn't know what it meant when I was 29, but now that 40 is in my rearview mirror, I understand better what it means to walk slowly.
Walk slowly.
And breathe deeply.
Breathe deeply.
And so I make peace with unmet expectations. I had a family that was perturbed with me because I was unable to offer our typical funeral service. And I understand that frustration, that disappointment, that anger. I understand. So I didn't take it personally. And I allowed those individuals to feel what they felt.
Right.
Because that was what they felt. What I also chose not to do was internalize it. Absolutely. And to feel bad because I was unable to meet an expectation, particularly an unreasonable expectation. So my hope for the people who are listening today is that, you know, in this time of global pandemic, that people learn how not just to be kind to other people, but to be kind to themselves, to allow our hearts, minds, souls, bodies to grieve, to lament, to cry. And at the same time, find ways to minister to yourselves. Take an extra bubble bath. You know, go and spend some time in nature, walking and experiencing time early in the morning with the birds, or, you know, spend some time expressing, because listen,
Self-care, mindfulness activities.
you can't please everybody.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Listen, this has been such a rich conversation. And I want to thank you, Pastor Janae, for joining me today. And guys, for everyone who tuned in today, make sure that you share this, even if someone wasn't able to join at this particular time. Make sure that you share this on your page, because our loss is collective at this point. And I think it has been such a rich conversation because it is a topic that we all share in some shape, form, or fashion. So that is it for today. Pastor Janae has wrapped it up for us. It has been wonderful. Make sure you tune in next week for Mondays with Mel. I'm here every Monday at 2 p.m. And that is it for today. Have a great one.
Did you share with them how to reach you if they need counseling?
And if you need to reach me, go to my business Facebook page, or you can reach me at matterofFocusEVV.com. Have a great day. Bye.